What if I told you that Britain was once ruled by a king so grotesque, so physically and morally decayed, that even before he died, he smelled of the grave, that for the last years of his reign, he wasn't a ruler, but a rotting corpse in a crown? This is not a tragic royal death. This is not a fall from grace. This is a slow-motion horror story, drenched in perfume and sweat, opium and wine, velvet robes and oozing flesh. This is the story of George IV, King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, who reigned from the year 1820 until his death in 1830. And long before he died, everyone knew something was very, very wrong. Born on August 12th, 1762, George Augustus Frederick was once called the first gentleman of England. He was charming, witty, fashionable, the very picture of aristocratic elegance. He had everything: looks, power, wealth, adoration. And yet, by the time he died, there was no one left to mourn him. Not his servants, not his doctors, not even his own family. Because George IV didn't just die, he decomposed day by day, in full view of the palace, and everyone from the footman who gagged while dressing him to the mistresses who fled the stench could smell it. His body ballooned beyond recognition, over 280 pounds. His legs so swollen with fluid he couldn't walk. His belly squeezed into corsets made of whalebone, and still spilling over. His appetite was a monstrous force, devouring entire feasts, even as his body begged for mercy. Wine and opium were his daily breakfast. Mirrors were banned from his chambers, and his face a melted mask, propped up by makeup and denial. But it wasn't just his body that fell apart. His mind fractured under the weight of addiction and shame. He wept. He raged. He accused servants of betrayal. He claimed he'd fought at Waterloo, a fantasy no one believed. He begged for more opium. He begged for more time. But death, cruel and patient, had been sitting beside him for years. By the final days of June 1830, the man who had once ruled an empire could no longer lie in a bed. He died sitting upright in a chair, head slumped, gasping for breath, as the palace filled with the unbearable odor of a monarch who had rotted from the inside out. And when he was finally gone, at 3:15 a.m., June 26th, 1830, the kingdom breathed a sigh of relief. Not sorrow, relief. Even in death, George IV was a burden. His coffin had to be specially reinforced to carry his weight. His embalming was a nightmare, and his funeral, a farce. A royal spectacle where no one cried. What happened to George IV? How did the most celebrated prince in British history become the most reviled? How did elegance collapse into horror? In the next chapters, we'll uncover the rise and fall of a man who ruled with silk and powder by day and screamed into the night like a creature cursed. Stay with us, because this story of rot, ruin, and royal disgrace has only just begun. He was never meant to be ordinary. From the moment George Augustus Frederick was born in the golden summer of 1762, the world expected something divine. A prince, radiant with wit, grace, and destiny. And for a time, he lived up to that promise. With auburn curls, a dazzling smile, and the kind of natural charm that made ministers squirm and duchesses swoon, the young prince glided through court society like a comet, blinding everyone in his path. But beneath the powdered surface, behind the velvet gloves and silk stockings, something was already rotting, a hunger not just for food or fashion, but for more of everything, more luxury, more power, more escape, By the age of 21, George had broken free from the rigid puritanism of his father, King George III, whose household was ruled by Protestant discipline and moral severity. The young prince set up his own residence at Carlton House, and with it, he created a palace, not just of architecture, but of appetite. Where his father counted pennies and fasted from indulgence, George built a court of excess, glittering with gold leaf furniture, crimson walls, imported silks, and drunken laughter echoing through halls drenched in perfume. He surrounded himself with gamblers, courtesans, actors, and sycophants, all eager to feed his growing need for stimulation. He drank like a sailor and spent like an emperor, throwing away public funds, and borrowed money on priceless art and tailor-made coats lined with ermine. And then there was the food. George did not eat. He devoured. His meals were not sustenance but performances, staged rituals of self-destruction. For breakfast, before the sun even touched the windows, he might consume 2 whole pigeons, 3 beefsteaks, a bottle of white wine, a glass of champagne, 2 ports, and a brandy chaser. And that was merely the overture. Lunchtime arrived with platters of game, roasts, pies dripping in butter, and sauces thick with cream and spice. His palate demanded novelty, and his chefs responded with grotesque ingenuity, turning kitchens into laboratories of cholesterol and decay. And dinner, a grotesque echo of ancient Rome suckling pigs, mountains of sausages, puddings swimming in syrup, tankards of ale and silver goblets of Tokay. Over just 6 weeks, in 1816, more than 5,000 pounds of meat were delivered to his household, not including poultry, venison, or the barrels of wine that flowed like a river between courses. As his appetite grew, so did his body. By the time George was in his mid-30s, he weighed nearly 250 pounds, a grotesque size for the Georgian era. His once sculpted features had collapsed into a doughy mask, cheeks sagging, eyes half shut with fat, chins stacked upon, chins like melted wax. Still, his vanity burned bright. He forced his swelling torso into whalebone corsets, gasping for breath, trying to mold his body into the image of youth. He painted his face with rouge and powder, refused to be seen without his wigs, and changed costumes multiple times a day, each outfit more flamboyant and desperate than the last. Mirrors followed him like loyal dogs, until the day came when he could no longer bear to see himself. And yet, beneath the painted surface, the emotional decay had already begun. In 1785, defying law and protocol, George secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow who, by the rules of the royal succession, could never be queen. It was a romantic act, cloaked in danger, part rebellion, part obsession. Their union was illegal, hidden, and hotly whispered about in every corner of London society. Maria was older, experienced, and entirely unsuitable. But George, in a rare moment of sincerity, had fallen for her, or at least the illusion of salvation she offered. Their love, though intense, was doomed. Parliament refused to recognise the marriage. The church disapproved. And George, ever slippery with duty, abandoned Maria when the Crown demanded a more political match. That political match came in 1795, when George was forced to marry his cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick, in what would become one of the most farcical and venomous royal marriages in European history. The first time they met, George recoiled in disgust. Caroline, unimpressed, declared that he looked nothing like his portraits. He ordered a brandy within minutes. She pretended not to notice the smell of stale perfume and sweat that clung to him. That very evening, the wedding night ended with the groom passed out, drunk, unconscious in the fireplace, his new bride watching in silence. Their union was a public disaster. They loathed each other, and they didn't hide it. George mocked her manners and accused her of affairs. Caroline ridiculed his weight and spent months refusing to see him. When their daughter, Princess Charlotte, was born, it was the only brief moment of peace between them, and even that didn't last. George abandoned Caroline almost entirely, and the press, always hungry for scandal, delighted in every humiliation. Cartoons of the prince as a bloated satyr filled newspapers, while Caroline was painted as the long-suffering wife of a gluttonous clown. By the early 1800s, George was no longer just a spoiled aristocrat. He was becoming a symbol of rot, a prince whose kingdom was his body, whose throne was built on velvet cushions and the bones of personal failure. His debts soared into the millions. His body ballooned. His emotional world became a swamp of betrayal, loneliness, and addiction. And yet the worst was still to come. Because the story of George IV is not just about how a prince indulged himself. It is about how an empire turned its face away, one breath at a time, as their future king transformed from a glittering heir into a living ghost, still years away from death, but already beginning to smell like it. The year was 1810. King George III, long plagued by his infamous madness, had finally succumbed to the shadows of the mind. Wandering through Windsor in a state of delusion, conversing with ghosts and angels, weeping for children long buried. And so, the crown passed, not officially, not yet, but functionally, into the trembling hands of his eldest son. Thus began the Regency, and with it, one of the most grotesquely opulent and tragically hollow chapters in British royal history. George Augustus Frederick became Prince Regent, ruler in all but name, sovereign of the empire's beating heart, and yet, beneath the robes and rituals, the man who now held the throne was already crumbling from the inside out. At Carlton House, the prince's palace of mirrors and meat, the days of reckless youth had fermented into something darker. The laughter of courtesans gave way to silence. The nightly banquets turned into orgies of excess that left guests retching in candlelit corridors, and George, swollen, sweating, and drugged into semi-oblivion, ruled not with wisdom, but with delusion. He was no longer simply indulgent. He was enthroned in flesh. A monarch whose empire was not carved in stone or sealed by Parliament, but built upon the bloated foundation of his own decaying body. His addiction had deepened, not merely to food or alcohol, though both still flowed in grotesque measure, but to laudanum, the syrupy poison of the elite, liquid opium, sweetened and disguised as medicine, became the true regent of England. George drank it by the 100-drop measure, day after day, until his mind hung like a painting knocked askew, recognizable, but forever tilted. One moment, he would dictate grand visions of architecture and art, commissioning pavilions, restoring castles, designing cityscapes with the flair of a Renaissance prince, and the next, he would slump into a velvet chair, his breath shallow, his gaze unfocused, speaking in circles about ghosts in his wardrobe, or accusing his attendants of conspiring to poison his tea. By 1816, his household received 5,000 pounds of meat in just 6 weeks, not counting birds, pastries, or the rivers of champagne. And though his court still sparkled on the surface, the Regency era forever remembered for its refinement, its literature, its artistry behind the embroidered curtains, was a monarch who could no longer walk upstairs without being hoisted like cargo, whose breath wheezed audibly in Parliament halls, whose feet, crippled by gout, bulged into grotesque shapes unrecognizable as human. And still he drank, and still he ate, And still he dosed himself with opium. Each drop meant to soften the pain, but instead, muting his mind until reality became a distant whisper. Servants whispered that he often forgot their names. Ministers found him slurring through meetings, nodding off mid-sentence. At times, he would erupt into tears without warning, or rage at invisible insults, banging his fists on tables, too delicate for the gesture. His skin, once admired for its youthful glow, had turned pale, damp, and blotched. His eyes clouded with cataracts, his fingers twisted by gout, his belly so distended it seemed to move of its own accord. Still, he clung to appearances. His costumes became more elaborate, more theatrical, as if he could camouflage his decay in enough silver thread and powdered lace. Diamonds, rented by the thousands, glittered on his robes while his body underneath festered in silence. Painters commissioned to capture his likeness spoke in hushed tones of the melancholy business of painting the king. They blurred the jowls, softened the bloated chin, painted over the eyes that now saw little and understood less. And though he had never formally been crowned, the Prince Regent reigned with the entitlement of a god and the physical presence of a disease made visible. He was England's burden, not yet dead, not fully alive, a monarch caught in purgatory. The public, once enchanted by tales of the dashing young George, had turned bitter. Satirical pamphlets portrayed him as a grotesque caricature, a monstrous belly seated on a gilded throne, dripping wine from both lips and wounds. Rumours spread that he could no longer feed himself, that his breath stank of decay, that his bedsheets had to be changed twice daily, not for sweat, but for sores that would not stop leaking. Though the palace denied it, those close to the court whispered truths far darker than fiction. By 1820, when George finally inherited the crown as George IV, the moment was met, not with celebration, but with barely concealed dread. His coronation, grotesquely expensive at nearly £1 million, became the final parody of majesty. Draped in silver robes, adorned with over 12,000 diamonds, the newly crowned king looked less like a sovereign and more like a bloated whale trapped in a masquerade. As one observer cruelly noted, behind him, a nation groaned under the weight of scandal. Var deept, and a monarch whose only consistency was his collapse. His physical suffering became legendary. He could no longer lie flat to sleep, his lungs crushed by his own weight, and was instead propped in a chair, dozing fitfully between bouts of laboured wheezing. Servants described the texture of his flesh as raw dough, soft, yielding, unnatural. Infection crept through folds of skin that could not be cleaned properly. He reeked of opium, sweat, and something deeper, the scent of slow decay. Visitors were warned to hold their breath near him. Queen Adelaide, wife of his brother William, fled his quarters entirely, citing the unbearable stench. His rooms, once perfumed with lavender and roses, now smelled of rot masked in desperation. And all the while, the man who once ruled glittering salons and seduced empires sat in silence, often sobbing for hours, begging doctors to lie to him, to tell him he would recover, to promise him a return to youth, to assure him he could still reign, still matter, still live. But the truth was no longer avoidable. George IV was a king in name only. His mind dissolved in syrupy poison. His body, a kingdom of infections. His rule, a theatre of shadows. And the question that began to rise in Parliament, in palaces, in whispered corners of the empire was no longer, "How is the king?" but rather, "How much longer must we wait for him to die?" By the winter of 1829, King George IV had become something less than royal. less than man, and somehow more than grotesque, a being suspended between suffering and survival, who had outlived the sympathy of his court, the patience of his people, and even the mercy of death itself. He was no longer a monarch in the traditional sense, not a ruler of policy or a voice of vision, but a monument to decay prolonged, a body swollen beyond recognition, a mind drugged beyond recovery, and a spirit corroded beyond salvation. He was, in the cruel whisper of one attending footman, a carcass with a crown. His body had become a prison of torment, not metaphorically, but anatomically. His legs, engorged with fluid from chronic dropsy, had ballooned to such size that movement became a feat of engineering. His knees could no longer bend. His ankles had vanished beneath folds of flesh, and his feet were so misshapen by gout that they could no longer fit into royal slippers. He could not walk. He could not bathe. He could not even relieve himself without assistance and pain. To move him between rooms, servants constructed an enormous wheeled chair reinforced with iron brackets and thick wooden beams, not unlike a cart used to haul livestock, and even that groaned under his weight. The palace floorboards buckled beneath him. Every corridor became an echo chamber of pulleys creaking, of fabric ripping, of servants grunting under breath, and still he would not die. Each day, his physicians watched with incredulous exhaustion as the king consumed food in quantities that defied logic and mercy. Roasted pheasants, rich puddings, boiled meats drenched in sauces, oysters and sausages and heavy bread soaked in gravy, all shoveled past lips cracked by fever and stained by brandy. He could barely chew, could not digest, often choked, and yet the rituals of the table continued. He demanded elaborate meals that he could neither enjoy nor endure, chewing mechanically between gasps, his breathing so labored that attendants feared he might suffocate between bites. Still, no one dared stop him. No one dared deny the king. Even more grotesque was his addiction to laudanum, which by this stage had reached such intensity that doctors secretly watered it down to avoid accidental overdose, not out of concern for his safety, but for fear of the scandal his sudden death might provoke. George consumed over 100 drops at a time, enough to fell a strong man in minutes, and still demanded more. Still claimed the pain was too sharp, the nights too long, the silence too heavy. Yet even in the grip of narcotic haze, his paranoia flickered like dying embers. He believed his servants laughed behind the door. He accused his physicians of plotting. He swore the wine had been poisoned, the food tampered with. He forgot their names, then forgot the accusations, then forgot he had ever spoken. And still he would not die. His skin had turned into something not quite human, stretched tight in places, sagging in others, blistered, broken, and sometimes oozing with lesions that never quite healed. The air in his chambers was described by one visitor as so thick with odour it made the candles cry. Even Queen Adelaide, his sister-in-law, relocated to distant quarters in Windsor Castle to avoid the smell. Servants wrapped cloth around their faces. They no longer whispered. They no longer pretended. They drew lots to determine who would endure the night vigils beside him, not out of loyalty, but obligation. To watch the king at night was to watch a man unravel, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, shaking from pain and withdrawal, sobbing into the darkness, muttering apologies to lovers long dead, to a father he had failed, to a daughter buried young, and yet sleep would not come. He could not lie flat. The sheer weight of his chest crushed his lungs, so he remained seated, propped with cushions, staring at the velvet canopy above, eyes milky from cataracts, lips trembling with both craving and confession. His moments of lucidity were worse than the confusion, for when clarity struck, George was haunted by all that had gone wrong. He begged his doctors to make him young again, to cut away the fat, to bring back his sight, to give him one last chance to rule with dignity. And when they offered silence instead of miracles, he turned on them with fury. "I am still the king," he once screamed, struggling to stand, failing, then collapsing into tears before a room full of silent men who had long since stopped seeing him as anything but a burden in ermine. And still he would not die. London, by now, had begun to laugh again. The Times ran subtle satire. Caricatures in the street markets showed a coffin too large for any hearse. Gossip flowed like port in Westminster that the king had forgotten how to sign his name, that his bowels were failing, that the rats avoided his quarters for fear of contamination. And still, the bulletins from the palace insisted he was in stable condition, resting comfortably, managing well. But no one believed it. The entire kingdom held its breath, waiting for the inevitable, and wondering why it was taking so long. In June of 1830, the waiting reached a fever pitch. His face had gone ashen, his breathing shallow, his eyes, near blind, wandered the room like birds trapped in a dying sky. On the night of June 25th, he suffered a collapse. Blood began pooling inside him. He knew. His last coherent words were whispered to his physician. "Sir Henry Halford, this is death." And still, it took him hours. At 3:15 in the morning, June 26th, 1830, George IV, the man who could not stop eating, could not stop drinking, could not stop living, finally ceased. His great, swollen head fell sideways onto his page's shoulder. The room fell silent, and for the first time in over a decade, so did England, but the stench remained. He had died. Finally, on the dawn of June 26th, 1830, in the silence between opium and breath, George IV collapsed into stillness. No trumpets, no solemn last words, no regal parting gesture to the realm he had once glittered over. Just one final, wet gasp, and then the unbearable weight of existence lifted from his lungs, only to fall with all its mass upon the rest of the kingdom. And now came the matter of the corpse. His body, already bloated and compromised before death, had begun to decompose while still warm. The stench persistent, chemical, and unnatural spread through the palace like smoke. Workers tasked with embalming him found themselves in a fight against time, tissue, and biology. The usual powders and perfumes failed. The royal physicians applied layer after layer of ointments, attempting to mask the smell that rose not just from the skin, but from somewhere deeper, as if the rot had not started with death, but had been waiting, patient, just beneath the surface for years. To contain him, they had to commission a special coffin, a monstrous structure of Spanish mahogany lined with lead, capable of supporting a body that weighed nearly 300 pounds and oozed with post-mortem fluids that soaked even the thickest of silk shrouds. The weight was so immense that the very floorboards of Windsor Castle had to be reinforced, corridors widened, support beams installed. Moving him became a feat of logistics. It took a team of exhausted servants, sweating under summer heat, to hoist the coffin inch by inch through the palace. Ropes snapped, pulleys creaked. The smell clung to their clothes for days. And yet, no one cried. There were no crowds weeping outside the gates, no desperate peasants throwing flowers before the funeral cart, no spontaneous songs of mourning. The people of Britain, upon hearing the news of their king's passing, responded not with grief, but with grim, almost guilty relief. Some newspapers printed polite notices. Others, most notably, the Times, let the mask fall. Their obituary asked, without pretense, "What eye has wept for him What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow? The answer, of course, was none. Even in death, George remained unmourned. His lying in state was a formality. Windsor Castle opened its chapel. The coffin was draped in royal fabric, surrounded by velvet ropes and sombre guards, and candles flickered against stained glass. But those who came did not come to honour. They came to gawk, to see for themselves that the rumours were true, that the bloated, wheezing monarch who had haunted the realm like a spectre was truly, irrevocably gone. They shuffled in, silent, curious, whispering not of legacy, but of sighs, too of smell, of how swollen his face looked beneath the veil. Even the funeral procession could not escape parody. The coffin groaned under the weight. Horses bulked. Footmen sweated through black uniforms made for smaller tasks. The air was thick with heat and embarrassment. Courtiers whispered behind gloved hands. Some chuckled. Others sighed. And all waited impatiently for the moment to pass. For the day to end. For the crown to move on. His brother, William IV, stood stiffly at the front. Not with sorrow, but with something closer to anticipation. Here was the moment he had waited decades for, the passing of the shadow that had swallowed court and crown alike. The ceremony at St. 25, George's chapel, that sacred space where kings are crowned and buried, was meant to be solemn, majestic, unforgettable. Instead, it was disjointed. The organ groaned. The priest stumbled. The choir sang out of key. Courtiers shifted in their seats. The scent, despite all precautions, remained faintly in the air. It was as if the very bones of the chapel resisted housing such a man. There were no heartfelt eulogies, no weeping dignitaries, no grand reflections on a life well lived, only the closing of a chapter best forgotten. Even his burial presented complications. The coffin, so large and lead-lined, could not be lowered into the royal vault by standard means. Engineers were brought in, pulleys, scaffolding, and reinforced beams were erected within the crypt. It took hours to lower the body of George IV into the earth, not because of ceremony, but because gravity itself seemed reluctant to receive him. And when the final bolt was turned, and the vault sealed, no one lingered. There were no stories of secret kindness, no hidden letters of comfort discovered in drawers, no lovers placing flowers on his grave. His mistresses had long abandoned him. His daughter had died before him. His people had turned cold. He had ruled for 10 years, reigned for 20, lived for nearly 70, and yet not a single mourner spoke of joy, of inspiration, of love. Only cost, only consequence, only waste. The Duke of Wellington, perhaps the most respected man in all of Britain, offered the only epitaph history remembers. He was the worst man I ever fell in with in my whole life, the most selfish, the most false, the most ill-natured, the most entirely without one redeeming quality. And it rang not as bitterness, but as truth, a verdict not just from one man, but from an entire nation. And so the reign of George IV ended not with a legacy, but with a lesson in vanity, in indulgence, in the grotesque cruelty of unchecked power. His story became a warning, his image, a caricature, on his memory, a burden no one wished to carry. When the sun rose over Britain the next day, it rose over a kingdom that finally quietly exhaled.